This episode is made possible by Roundel. If you partner with Roundel, you can reach over 165 million guests who look to Target for joy and inspiration. It's a lot of people. Together with you, they'll design curated media solutions that are a seamless extension of the Target experience. And everything, all of it, is backed by unparalleled first-party data and, of course, measurements. If you would like to find out more about what I'm talking about, you can head to roundel.com.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Behind the Numbers Around the World, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Roundel. It's Thursday, June the 27th. I'm your host, Bill Fisher, and it's my pleasure, as it always is, to welcome you to Around the World. And this month, we're talking about political content on digital platforms around elections. Welcome, folks, to a Behind the Numbers show that takes you around the world, looking at what various countries are doing in the worlds of commerce, media, and advertising. Each month, we have our 3 in 3 global news recap. Then we have Talking Heads, where my guests and I have an open discussion about the main theme for today's show, which, as I've mentioned, is about political content around elections. And we finish it all off with my devious recap stats quiz, again, all related to the topic at hand. This month, we will be asking just how important are digital platforms in election campaigns?
But they're also using organic social tactics, whether that's creator or celebrity partnerships, in order to connect with young voters on those platforms, some of which, like TikTok or Pinterest, don't actually allow political ads.
How easy is it to regulate campaigning on these platforms?
I think you're asking people who don't necessarily understand the technology and its capabilities, and for good and for bad, to really try to regulate it in a meaningful way that's not unfair to the platforms.
And does AI represent an existential crisis for political advertising?
But I look at some of the videos, it's pretty convincing if you're not too, savvy on who the actual anchors are for some of these shows.
Okay, I have 3 experts to help me out with today's show. Let's get them involved. First up, we have our jet-setting social media expert, fresh from hobnobbing with Taylor Swift in Cannes, or maybe not. It's Jasmine Emberg. Hello there, Jasmine.
I wish Taylor Swift had been there, but unfortunately not. But thank you so much for having me. I'm happy to be here.
Great to have you on the show. Next, he's our Latin American guru. He's Mateo Savels. Hello, Mateo.
Hello, Bill. Great to be here.
A pleasure to have you on the show. And last but not least, he's our Canadian kingpin. It's Paul Briggs. Hey, Paul, how are you?
Hey, Bill. I'm good. Thanks for having me.
Great to have you as well. Okay, before we get into the episode proper, let me introduce you to this month's Culture Shock. And given we're talking politics and elections, let me tell you about mandatory voting. So according to World Population Review, you are required by law to vote in elections in 26 countries around the world. 11 of those countries are in South and Central America. And though most infractions result in a fine, in Bolivia, things get a bit more serious than that. In the country, a voter is given a card once they voted as proof of participation. If they then fail to show this proof within a 3-month period following the election when asked to do so, their salary may be withheld from them via their bank. Pretty harsh.
Wow.
Do you know any folks that might fall foul to such a law?
I remember this from when I lived in Argentina, actually. And I believe this was before digital voting or mail voting. I'm not sure, actually, if they even have that yet in Argentina. But at the time, they didn't. So you had to go back to your hometown where you were registered if it was different from where you were living in order to vote.
Wow. Sounds like something from the Bible, that, doesn't it? Heading back to Nazareth or something for a... Yeah. Okay. Right. Let's crack on with the next segment. This is our new segment, which we call 3 in 3. I have 3 interesting and related news stories. I'm going to introduce in turn one story to one guest, and they're going to give me their quick take. Between the two of us, we're going to do it all in a minute. So 3 stories in 3 minutes. The timer is set. Let's go. Story 1 is for Jasmine. In the UK, according to the Byline Times, the Telegraph newspaper has been reminded by the Electoral Commission about the rules around partisan campaigning after pushing anti-Labour stories and ads on Meta and on X. Ultimately, no sanction was handed out, as the regulator ruled the ads didn't present any clear call to action. Jasmine, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, even though this ended up being somewhat of a non-story, I think it does show how murky some of the rules around political advertising can be on social media. And that's, of course, especially concerning in an election year. But beyond that, I also think it's a great example of how the lines between news, politics, and entertainment have blurred. And so even without this so-called call to action in the ads, I was struck by how clickbaity and divisive those headlines were. And that makes sense from Telegraph's point of view, because as we've learned, that tends to be the kind of content that grabs our attention on social. But it can be problematic, of course, for Meta and X because they're making money off of that kind of engagement. And of course, also for society if it ends up interfering or affecting election outcomes.
Great points. That was our first story. Story 2 is for Paul, and this is a slightly older story, but very interesting nonetheless. In February's Pakistani elections, votes were still being counted when former Prime Minister Imran Khan claimed victory for his party, the PTI. Nothing unusual there. Until you hear that Imran Khan was in jail and his video message was AI generated. Paul, just how concerning is this story?
I think it's very concerning, and I think it kind of speaks to a couple of conditions that are at play with people on digital media generally. One is media literacy, just the understanding of how, and especially digital media literacy, how content is produced, what is the source of the content, and what are the content's aims. So I think, generally speaking, I think people have a lower understanding of that these days. And the ability for people to go direct to the public, averting the usual channels, which is sort of, news media, going direct through channels like YouTube can be beneficial to candidates, but can also be very confusing for people who don't understand the value of an important news media.
Indeed. Thanks, Paul. That was story 2. Story 3 is for Mateo, and Mexico's recent elections saw Claudia Sheinbaum elected as the country's first female president. But the campaign was quite nasty, with the female nominees each being exposed to personal attacks focusing on their appearance and credentials. Social media, unsurprisingly, was a particular breeding ground for such comments. Mateo, is there any way to counter this sort of thing?
Unfortunately, I always think that during election seasons, we see the worst in humanity. We have a lot of polarization. We have a lot of negative comments on all sides of the spectrum. And in the case of Mexico, you had 2 women as front runners with that. So that opens the door to a lot of harsh criticism, especially in a country where machista culture runs wild. I'd say for counteracting, I think it's not just a problem just for Mexico, but a global problem in terms of how do you moderate negative language that can be construed as bullying, harassment, and even misinformation that we're seeing run rampant. And in the case of Mexico, we do see that, unlike other countries, there is a general distrust in news media from Mexican consumers and the populace at large, and they turn to social media. So roughly about 50% of people in Mexico get their news from Facebook, and we do see a rise in things like YouTube and WhatsApp in particular. So when you have this unfact-checked, sometimes sources, that really does lead to a spread of disinformation. So on the platform side, better job at regulating, but on the candidate side too, making sure you are controlling the narrative with the facts.
Thanks, Mateo. And that wraps up our 3 in 3 for this month. Okay, now it's time for the main part of the show, what we call Talking Heads. This is where we dig a little bit deeper in today's topic. So 2024, it's the year of elections, it seems. According to Time magazine, nearly half of the world's population, yes, half of the population, 49% actually, will head to the polls this year in at least 64 different countries. But we're in an ever more digitalized world, ever more polarized, it seems, as well. So how do we deal with, as Mateo mentioned, the spread of disinformation? How have laws adapted to cover digital platforms? And just how important are these platforms in helping elect new leaders? So let's start with that question. How important are these platforms? I mean, obviously, we know people spend more and more time with digital. So how are politicians leaning in to digital? Who wants to kick us off?
I would argue that it's probably the most important channel for candidates these days because most people are getting their news via social media. And I think it's proven that spending in social media channels to promote a message is very effective and especially effective for political parties.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, if you think about the US in the grand scheme of things, digital is hugely important, even though traditional media still accounts for the majority of political ad spending here. And that's because the growth we're seeing in political ad spending really is coming from digital channels, mainly CTV. On the social media side, which is, of course, what I cover, we have seen political advertisers become a little bit more skittish towards the platforms, but they're still spending heavily. But they're also using organic social tactics, whether that's creator or celebrity partnerships, in order to connect with young voters on those platforms, some of which, like TikTok or Pinterest, don't actually allow political ads. I think, President Biden and Donald Trump joining TikTok really is a case in point of just how important digital platforms, social media platforms in particular, are to reaching those young voters who aren't going to be watching traditional TV and are less receptive to traditional forms of advertising.
I concur with that. And I think when we step back a bit too and look at emerging markets, which I cover within Latin America, a lot of the population does skew younger. And where are younger consumers getting their information? Social media. And I think it was a really clear evidence when we looked at Argentina, which had its elections at the end of last year, that, you look at a divisive candidate like Javier Milei, who was crowned really the king of Instagram and TikTok because he leveraged those platforms to talk to the populace in that age group, of which, I think it's about a third of the voting population in Argentina is under 29. So if you're able to dominate these digital public squares and really get a footing in there, they are very important. And just to step back to the Mexico one, since we talked about earlier, I think it's interesting when we look at kind of like the spend in terms of what their campaign budget was spent on. Claudia Sheinbaum only spent about 11% of her media budget on social media. So I think versus her other rivaling candidate spent almost 30%. So it is interesting to see how politicians are thinking about their media buys and where they're spending them.
You mentioned, what was it, a third of the population being under 29,
Yes.
right? So two-thirds are older than that. So you've got to reach those as well, right? So surely these old traditional methods of reaching them still must curry some favor, right?
Yes and no, because even when we do look at demographic habits, we do see older demographics migrating towards social platforms because of that general distrust in media outlets. So then we go back into the, the bread and butter basics, as I'm sure Jasmine can tell you too. You see a little older migration towards Facebook, the millennials towards Instagram, the younger ones on TikTok. And then you start seeing those general social habits play out within the news gathering and political information realm. So yes, TV does have that mass reach, but in this more interconnected world and where these platforms are gaining a bigger foothold, the social platforms are really winning out.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to something Jasmine said about the share of traditional versus digital from political parties or the government in general. I had to look at what's happening in Canada, and it seems to be maybe the opposite of what's happening in the U.S. So in 2023 year, the report I was looking at, reports on that given year, 70% of government ad spending was in digital channels and 16% was in social media. Now, that's just a non-election year, that sort of run-of-the-mill government advertising. It probably would switch in an election year where TV becomes much more effective as a way to get your message out. But I just find that interesting, that share may be a little different in Canada than it is in the US or elsewhere.
Well, I think also one of the reasons that traditional channels, especially TV, remain so important for political advertisers is because it's safer. This is pre-produced content that you're advertising against. When you're on social media, it can be kind of a free-for-all. These are primarily user-generated platforms, and I spend a lot of time thinking about what it means that you now have political creators or politicians partnering with creators to share news. And, that poses a lot of risk for the candidates as well, because if you're posting a quick TikTok or an Instagram reel, there's a lot that can be lost in translation, so to speak. And even a well-timed meme can be taken out of context or misunderstood. And now we have AI, and that makes content really easy and quick to manipulate in a very compelling way. And once that's out in the world on social media, it spreads like wildfire.
It's easier to regulate TV as well, right? Is that fair?
Well, yes, in the US, there are regulations for TV that don't exist for social media.
I'd say yes and no, depending on what media freedoms you have, because you do have certain countries where the government does influence, or the party in charge does influence the media. So you are going to be fed that state-sponsored propaganda or from the party in control, where then the social platforms become that counterbalance to, what the party line is towing in the mainstream media. So I mean, even look in the US too. I mean, you have, there are very few middle of the road, it's getting a bit more polarized here too. So that puts the onus on you, the voter, to understand, okay, here, this side, and what is actually, what conclusion can I draw? Because I do think even with media companies, there are certain biases and swings towards one side of the spectrum or the other.
Of course. I mean, we're all human, right? I mean, everybody is going to have a bias. And even if you think about the ways in which news organizations pick the stories, I mean, there's some bias there, even if it's supposed to be an objective news source. And, just to echo some of the things that, you said about Mexico, we've seen a big shift in people getting their news on social media here in the US too. The figures are somewhat similar to what you see in Mexico, for example. I do think we need to differentiate between getting news on social media and going to social media for news, because the platforms have gotten really good at serving you that content, except for the ones, of course, that have vowed not to promote it. I'm looking at Threads, for example. And so there are a lot of people who are on social media and stumble across news because it's unavoidable, even if they're trying not to participate in it.
So how are these platforms going about ensuring that you're not being fed a steady diet of disinformation? How are they going about regulating these things?
Well, social media in particular, I mean, it's tough, right? These are global companies. They operate in many different countries that have different laws that they need to adhere to. And this is by no means an excuse, because they haven't been good at content moderation for a really long time. And that was before the age of AI. And now we're in this situation, again, where media is so much easier and quicker to manipulate in this very compelling way. And these platforms have also pulled back a lot of their content moderation teams and rules. They've actually replaced some of those with AI, which is really interesting, because I always think of AI as being both the problem and the solution to the misinformation problem, because, of course, AI tools can help you combat mis and disinformation at scale, but there's still a lot that slips through the cracks. And especially when it comes to political advertising on these platforms, the guidelines are still evolving, the rules are still evolving, and some of them are too little too late. So if you think about Meta and YouTube, for example, they now require political advertisers or issue advertisers to label ads that have been made using AI. But, that isn't necessarily going to be enough. And then also Meta, for example, is going back to its kind of age-old policy of not allowing political ads in the week before the US election. But there's still a lot of time for information and those ads to spread before that.
And I mean, even since you mentioned YouTube, I think it was interesting too what some countries are in terms of regulation, or in terms of how these global companies are navigating these regulatory environments. So in Brazil, for instance, they'll be having municipal elections later this year, I think in October. And Google will not be accepting political ads on its platform because, in compliance with some new regulation passed earlier this year. So we do see, some stance with that. But yeah, with the use of AI, I think it's a whole new complex wild, wild west in terms of, the technology is really getting good. So some of these avatars you see, it's kind of some of them, it's hard to discern, is this actually a person or is this not? Is this a deep fake? Is this not? So I think the technology is advancing a bit faster than the platforms can keep up with regulating it or keeping it in check.
And it's moving so fast that the regulators are having a hard time keeping up too. I know, in this country, it's very early days on the government trying to figure out how to regulate AI and putting it into a larger set of legislation around digital policy. And it's sort of uninformed at this point because what's around the corner is very hard to see. And I think you're asking people who don't necessarily understand the technology and its capabilities, and for good and for bad, to really try to regulate it in a meaningful way that's not unfair to the platforms.
That sounds very much like what's happening in the US.
Yeah, I mean, the story about Imran Khan was a bit mind-boggling to me. And Matteo, I believe you had a story about something similar in Venezuela happening, right?
Yes. So as we were saying about state-controlled media, so that's a very prime example of it in terms of how politicians are trying to control the narrative in what is supposed to be a free and fair election, quotation marks, where we see, with Nicolas Maduro putting fake news anchors through using AI to create fake news stories with fake news anchors, but passing it off as real live anchors and real live news, but then disseminating it out through social platforms So then you start seeing people sharing it and the usual, rabbit hole that you go down. So, but I mean, I look at some of the videos. I mean, it's pretty convincing if you're not too, savvy on who the actual anchors are for some of these shows. So it does pose a problem, and it does pose, how do you break through this noise when what is seeming to be a legitimate news anchor and a legitimate news show really is just state-sponsored AI misinformation or propaganda.
Can I give you a little bit of a hot take on what I think in the US at least?
Please do.
Well, so when it comes to AI, because we're already so polarized, I find it very hard to believe that there will be a single piece or even several pieces of AI-generated content, myths, or disinformation that is going to make a real difference in the election outcome here. I do think, however, that it could serve to further entrench our views and make us even more divided, which we know can lead to really terrible real-world consequences. Where I'm probably most concerned about AI is its ability now to surface more mis and disinformation and other bad content, particularly as social platforms as they continue to lean into AI to bring more relevant content to users. Because that too can have this profound impact on how we all view the world and political events, even if it isn't necessarily going to change how we vote come November.
Interesting. Okay, a really, really interesting discussion there, but that's all we've got time for, unfortunately, because it's now time for our recap stats quiz. Okay, this is where we recap today's theme with a few related stats questions. There's no prize. It's all about bragging rights. There are only 3 questions and they're multiple choice, so it's nice and quick and relatively easy. I'm going to ask each of you to Slack me your answers, so there's no room for influence or anything like that. Okay, so first question. I spoke earlier in the culture shock section about mandatory voting. Well, just because something's mandatory doesn't mean everybody falls into line. There are always going to be exemptions and things like that, but some people just won't vote anyway. I mentioned the threat of withholding salary in Bolivia, but what do we think the last election turnout percentage was in the country? This was according to Our World in Data. So the last time Bolivia had an election, what was the percentage turnout? And here are your options. So get ready to Slack me. We have 88%, 96%, or 99%.
I'm nervous.
You all went for 96%.
Oh.
And you were all incorrect. That was the figure for Vietnam. Now, voting isn't mandatory in Vietnam, but you may or may not know there's a one-party communist state in operation there, and elections are very strictly policed and encouraged, so that's why that figure is so high. 99% is also incorrect. Any idea what country has a 99% turnout?
Is it Australia?
No, it's the right sort of side of the world. North Korea.
Oh, well.
Need I say more? It's pretty obvious.
Right side of the world, but very different country.
Yes. So 88% was actually the answer, which, as Paul says, it's still pretty high, but a lean month for a few people, I imagine, if they get caught. No salary. Okay, so all to play for, because I don't need to go through the scores. We know no one's got anything. So for our second question, we are headed to Ireland, where EU elections took place earlier this month, and Global Witness conducted a test there. It submitted 16 ads containing election disinformation to TikTok, YouTube, and X. Which platform do you think performed worst, i.e. it allowed the most ads through its vetting systems, even though it contained disinformation? So they are your 3 options: YouTube, TikTok, or X.
Are they political ads?
Political ads, yeah.
I feel like this is a trick question.
Okay, the answers are in.
Unanimous again, Bill? Are we all in agreement?
It's not quite unanimous, no. We almost. So Matteo and Paul, you opted for X, which I would probably have gone for that. I would have been as wrong as you are. It actually performed best. All ads were rejected. So whatever your opinions on X, with this very small sample, it performed very well. Jasmine, you've plumped for YouTube, which is also incorrect. It did a little bit worse. It rejected all but 2 of the ads. But the worst performing was TikTok. How many ads do we think it let through out of 16?
15?
Close. 16, all of them.
Wow.
It allowed all of them through. However, In response to the investigation, TikTok said that all 16 of the ads did indeed violate its advertising policies and were correctly identified by its systems, but they were approved after additional review by a moderator. So it was a human error, and the moderator has since received retraining, as you would hope. And I should also add that Global Witness removed all the ads after review so that they weren't shown to anybody.
That's very interesting. I mean, TikTok technically bans political advertising, and yet all 16 went through.
There you go. Well, I can give you a score, but it's still pretty even on 0-all. Okay, so let's see if we can do better with our final question. We're going to look at the perception of AI in political advertising. And this is a UK study from the Ada Lovelace Institute and the Alan Turing Institute. It asked UK adults about the perceived benefits and concerns with AI in a number of different fields, and it came up with a net benefit score in those fields. So all the overall concerns were subtracted from the perceived benefits to give a score. The question is, which of the following had a more negative score than targeted political advertising? So the use of AI in these fields was perceived as more negative than for targeted political advertising. And your categories are autonomous weapons, driverless cars, or robotic vacuum cleaners. So weapons, cars, or vacuums. Which do you think people thought had a worst score? And everybody is in agreement on this one.
Are we all wrong?
Driverless cars. Well, let me just go through the answers. So robotic vacuum cleaners, as you might expect, was actually the most positive. It had a positive 1.36 score. So people aren't really concerned about AI and robotic vacuum cleaners, as you would expect. The next highest was autonomous weapons with a minus 0.43 score. And the lowest score was driverless cars with minus 0.52. I'm going to give you all a point, but the answer is actually none of them. So targeted political advertising was bottom of the list with minus 0.73. So people are more concerned about AI in targeted political advertising than they are with driverless cars or autonomous weapons, which blows my mind a little bit and concerns me a little bit.
Bill, that was a trick question.
It was a trick question, which is why I've given you all a point. So you all score 1, and we get to the end of the recap stats quiz with a 3-way tie, which means I get to ask my tie-break question. So I've planned this. It's as if I've planned it anyway. Okay, so this is a free-form answer. I'm not going to give you any options. You just have to give me a number. So we're going to return to voter turnout for this, and I've picked Tunisia for no obvious reason, or maybe it is for a reason, who knows. So Tunisia held parliamentary runoffs in January 2023. What do you think the voter turnout was in percent? Just give me a number, any number.
60.
I put 70.
Oh, you're just going to shout it out, are you? You're not going to. You're not going by slack.
I'm so confident in that number. I had to shout it out.
I mean, I went with a solid 70. It was a very knee-jerk reaction, so we'll go with that.
I'm going to shout mine out and say 48.
48. Oh, good, because that means we got a clear winner. And the winner is Jasmine. The answer was 11%.
Whoa.
Wow.
It was essentially a protest because the incumbent's agenda and seizure of powers was so overreaching. Loads of parties didn't even put their name into the ballot, and lots of people just didn't turn out as a result. Anyway, we have a winner. Jasmine, congratulations.
Thank you. What do I win?
Nothing. The adulation of your peers. Anyway, we always end this show with a winner because it is time to end the show, unfortunately. Congratulations again, Jasmine, and thanks for speaking with us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Matteo, thanks for being back on the show again. Been a while.
It's been a while, but always a pleasure.
And Paul, thanks to you as ever.
Thanks, Bill.
And thanks to all of you for listening in to Around the World, an eMarketer podcast made possible by Roundel. Tune in tomorrow for our weekly listen show hosted by Marcus. If you want to ask us any questions, you can, of course, email us at podcast@eMarketer.com. I hope that next month you can give me your vote of confidence and join me for another edition of Behind the Numbers Around the World. Bye for now.